For ages, the Mediterranean was considered the center of the world. From the Mideast to the Straits of Gibraltar, and from the south of France to the north of Africa, this inland sea has seen so many civilizations since antiquity that its shores are rich with some of the most beautiful cities in the world. In each one of these cities, there live men and women whose lives and traditions are the fruit of an amazing mix of cultures and religions. From Marseille's Old Port to the Barrio Gótico in Barcelona, from the Almudaina Palace in Palma to the Medina of Tunis, from the fortifications of Malta to the Cathedral of Palermo and the masterpieces of Rome, the Eternal City, all the cities that we'll be visiting during this voyage are, each in its own way, capitals of the Mediterranean. Our cruise began in Genoa. Now, in the early morning after sailing all night, we've come into sight of Marseille. Marseille is the great historical port of France's Mediterranean coast. The oldest city of France and a true city of Provence, where the air is steeped in the fragrance of lavender and the fresh breeze of the sea, Marseille ripples with the sun-soaked accents of characters straight out of a novel by Marcel Pagnol, the most famous writer of the region. Times have changed. The old port, which used to be the heart of Marseille's activity, is now a marina for pleasure boats and excursions. Only a few of these traditional boats, called pointus, still tie up here to unload their morning's catch. Down through the centuries, the activity of the port followed the history of the city. The slow periods under Louis XIV and after the Revolution alternated with more prosperous times under the reign of François I, and even better times at the beginning of the 19th century when France embarked on its period of overseas colonization. The sailing ships and then the steamships of the big maritime companies set out from here to the four corners of the earth, towards Algeria from 1830 on, then starting in 1869 when the Suez Canal was opened, to Africa and far-off Asia. In a few decades, Marseille became a cosmopolitan metropolis. Orphans of a bygone era, the wharfs of La Joliette are now used by a good number of cruise ships and the ferries heading for Corsica and North Africa. Marseille's long romance with the world began a long time ago, 2,600 years ago, when one fine day, a handful of Greek colonists landed in the little uninhabited inlet.
Here we are on the site of what we call the ancient port, which is almost 200 meters from the old port. So this is the dead center of the city of Marseille, and with this archaeological site we see the origins of the city laid bare. We're at the end of the rocky inlet of Marseille that was discovered by the Greek sailors from Phocaea 2,600 years ago. So these were the quays of the ancient Greek, then Roman port of Marseille. In ancient times, Marseille was in fact a port that handled, let's say, strategic products, commercial products such as wine, olive oil, salted fish, metals as well, grain. So these were products and raw materials that were, of course, extremely important for life around the Mediterranean basin, and even throughout the rest of Europe.
Even though Marseille never regained the level of trade it had in ancient times, it remained an active port all through the Middle Ages. Then in the 15th century, it enjoyed another period of prosperity thanks to the accords between Francois I and the Ottoman Emperor Suleiman the Magnificent, and Marseille became an active hub of trade with the East. During the 17th century, France, like Holland and England, created their companies of the East and West Indies. However, thanks to the initiative of Colbert, Louis XIV's Minister of Finance, France also founded a Company of the Levant, which gave Marseille a new economic lease on life. The city and the port have undergone transformations. Louis XIV had a fortress built around the old St. John fort, dating from the 15th century. Later, the round tower of the Fanal was added on. And lastly, the Fort St. Nicholas was erected on the opposite bank of the narrow channel that marks the entrance to the inlet. These sites, charged with history, are now favorite places for a Sunday walk. All the Marseillais that gather here to enjoy the sun and sea are children of the Mediterranean. Their cultural diversity is essential for Marseille to remain Marseille, a cosmopolitan city open to the world. Our cruise boat, the Pacifica, is making its maiden voyage. In the late afternoon, we leave Marseille. On board, crew and passengers alike have dressed up for the evening's festivities, when the captain, faithful to tradition, welcomes the passengers.
Il comandante di Costa Pacifica, Giuseppe Russo!
Signori, ancora una volta vi ringrazio per aver scelto questa crociera inaugurale qui sulla Costa Pacifica e sono sicuro che durante questi giorni apprezzerete la bellezza, l'allegria e i colori che vi offrono questa nave. Ancora una volta grazie e vi auguro una splendida crociera con voi.
Another night of sailing brings us into view of Barcelona, our second port of call. The renovations carried out for the 1992 Olympic Games were an opportunity for the urban planners to open the city once again onto the sea. The port was modernized, and the Catalan capital is now one of the Mediterranean's busiest ports of call. This newfound modern touch harks back to the turn of the 20th century, when a need to innovate swept through the major European cities. Modernismo was Barcelona's answer to England's modern style, Germany and Austria's Jugendstil, and France's Art Nouveau. Antonio Gaudi's Sagrada Familia Cathedral is the symbol of Catalonia's Modernismo. Begun in 1891, the cathedral designed by the Catalonian architect is still under construction. It arouses the enthusiasm and curiosity of the millions of people that visit it every year. When Gaudi died in 1926, only one of the 18 towers he had planned had been finished. Breaking with the academism prevailing in the 19th century, Gaudi found inspiration in plant and animal forms. and incorporated elements of traditional crafts into his work as well, such as colored tiles. The creations of Gaudí and Luis Dominic Montaner, the architect of the Palace of Catalan Music, are works of art in themselves. Giving free rein to their imagination, it seems as if they designed these buildings not so much for people to use, as for people to admire. A stroll in the Barrio Gótico, the Gothic sector far from the city's modernistic fantasies, allows us to discover a different facet of Barcelona. In the 13th century, Barcelona was striving to become a major maritime power on a par with Pisa and Genoa. To that end, it first seized the Balearic Islands off the east coast of Spain, which at the time were in the hands of the Moorish traders. Its expansion continued in the 14th century, and the city added improvements. During his reign, Pere III, the Ceremonious, constructed a good number of palaces and churches. He also expanded the royal shipyards, the Drassans, which now house Barcelona's Maritime Museum. This is where those fearsome warships, the galleys, were assembled. Under one of the museum's naves is a scale model of the royal galley of Don John of Austria. The original ship took part in the famous Battle of Lepanto in 1571, which put a halt to the Ottoman expansion in the Mediterranean.
In medieval times, controlling the Mediterranean meant controlling world trade. For Catalonia, the opening of consulates, meaning trading posts, throughout the Mediterranean was very important, as was the maritime expansion of Catalonia, which began first with the conquest of the Balearic Islands, then Sicily, followed by southern Italy, plus a presence in Greece. And this expansion allowed Catalonia to consolidate its sea routes and to transport the precious merchandise of the Orient to the Kingdom of Aragon.
Our stopover in Barcelona is drawing to a close. We're taking a walk down the Ramblas, the favorite place for a stroll for the Barcelonese as well as for the tourists. At the bottom of the long pedestrian avenue, the statue of Christopher Columbus, perched on top of his column, seems to be pointing out the direction to our next port of call, Palma, Mallorca. Once again, the Mediterranean sun is there to light up our arrival in Palma, Mallorca. cathedral, Laseo as the Mallorcans call it, is Palma's most important monument. Firstly, on account of its size, and secondly, because its construction, begun in 1230, was undertaken on the site of a mosque in order to underline the reconquest of the islands from the Moors, who had occupied it since the 9th century. The Almudaina Palace was originally a citadel constructed by the Moorish governors to dominate the Bay of Palma. After it was conquered, King Jaime II transformed it, adding crenellated towers and arcades. Little by little, the Catholic sovereigns erased the traces of the long Arab occupation. Yet, hidden away in its bower of greenery is the one single building built in the 11th century that has survived intact down to the present day: the Arab Baths.
If we were to speak of a first golden age in Palma, it would be the time of the Islamic period. The conquest of 1229 didn't put an end to that golden age, just the opposite. It reinforced it, and that golden age lasted until the 15th century. Mallorca has always had active relations with the other Mediterranean cities. But if we had to pick out particularly strong links, it would be with Italy, and in particular with the regions of Naples and Sicily, likewise with the port cities of North Africa. With the discovery of America and the rise of navigation on the Atlantic, Mallorca's ships fell behind the times technologically, and so they were less profitable for trade.
The day slowly fades from the enchanted shores of Palma, Mallorca. In a friendly atmosphere, the municipal band launches into its medley of españolades. A little later on in the evening, we get back to the Pacifica, sparkling with a myriad of lights in the port of Palma. On board, the party is in full swing.
I had to step into the backside. I had to take myself from the inside. Yeah.
One day's sailing from Palma, Mallorca brings us within reach of the coast of North Africa. Our stopover in Tunis will open the doors to another world for us. will soon be arriving at La Goulette, the port of Tunis. Here we're treading on the shores that gave birth to one of the most brilliant civilizations of antiquity, Carthage. Founded in the 11th century before our era by Phoenician traders, Carthage rapidly came to dominate trade in the Mediterranean, particularly in gold and tin. In the 3rd century BC, it eventually succumbed to the power of Rome that would tolerate no rivals. The Romans destroyed the entire city, and now practically nothing remains. We leave Carthage to its solitude and head for Tunis, the capital with two faces. On the one hand, you have the modern city, with its wide avenues lined with Art Deco buildings, a souvenir of the French protectorate that was established in 1881. And on the other, there's the Medina, the oriental city whose entry is marked by the majestic Porte de France gate, a vestige of the ancient surrounding walls. Designated a World Heritage Site, the Medina of Tunis is home to a wealth of palaces, mosques, and an incredible labyrinth of souks. The souks of Tunis fulfill much the same function as the bazaars that the Ottomans, rulers of the country for many centuries, laid out in all the cities of their empire. The pattern is very simple. The vendors and craftsmen are grouped according to their professions. Wandering through the maze of narrow streets, you come out onto a square of magnificent arcades. This is the jeweler's souk. Continuing our walk, we pass through the Babouche souk. Then, drawn by the aroma of spices and flowers, we arrive at the perfumer's souk. A little further on in the Fez souk, we meet Habib. And over a glass of tea, he tells us about the souk in his own inimitable way, like a merchant philosopher.
The souks are all very well organized here. Each souk used to have what they called an amin. The amin was the man who was responsible for the quality of the products. Take the fezzes, for example. The authenticity of the product depended on the density of the knots used to make this traditional Tunisian bonnet, on the type of wool that was used, on the dyes used. Should be an authentic vegetable dye. If it's a chemical dye, every time it rains you have red streaks running down all over your face. That never happens with natural colors. The amin also controlled the prices. The amin of the Fez souk would be paid a commission on everything sold in the souk for 1 year only. And every year they held elections to choose a new amin. There's a very friendly atmosphere in the souk. We say that our life is here because we spend more time with the other vendors than with our own families and children. We spend about 12 hours here with the other shopkeepers every day. We talk about this and that, we have a few laughs, sometimes we quarrel, but the next day we shake hands, it's forgotten. It's always very friendly. As long as we're all together here, we'll keep on smiling.
Once again, we've set out to sea. In 4 days, we've already covered half of the Mediterranean. Marseille, Barcelona, Palma, Tunis. And our cruise is far from over. We still have some magnificent cities to discover, beginning with Valletta, the capital of Malta, our next stop. Malta's geographical situation at the crossroads of the maritime routes running from Africa to Europe made it a coveted prize all through its long history. Phoenicians, Greeks, Carthaginians, and Romans each seized it in turn. In the 9th century, Arabs from Tunisia took over for 2 long centuries before yielding their place to the Normans of Sicily, and then the Aragonese. However, it was the Knights of Malta who took possession of the island in 1530 that gave the island its identity, and Valletta its fortifications that are still such an impressive sight when one arrives by sea. Valletta, built on a hilltop within the safety of its ramparts, has a picturesque charm.
Well, obviously Malta is in the middle of the Mediterranean, and the influences are various. We start off with a history of 300 years under the Arabs, and they have influenced so much our language. Starting off, for example, with the way we speak in Maltese, like Saha, Merhaba, Kifint, Kollox Tayyeb. These are all influences from the Arabic language.
After the long Arab domination through the 9th and 10th centuries, the Normans brought Malta back into the fold of Christendom in the early 12th century. From the 13th century on, as the Ottoman domination spread through the Mediterranean, the Knights of Malta were successively forced to leave Jerusalem in 1291, then Cyprus in 1310, and Rhodes in 1523. They arrived in Malta in 1530. Mdina, the former capital of the island, is charged with a turbulent history. In 870, it was taken over by the Arabs who gave it its name, Mdina, the city. Then, in the early 12th century, it was conquered by the Normans who constructed the city's finest monuments. The construction of the new capital, Valletta, begun in 1566, marked the decline of Mdina. Now, Mdina is no more than a museum city with 350 inhabitants.
Malta has always been one of the main targets by many nations to be conquered. And when the Knights came here in Malta, they find fewer little fortifications. Basically, the Knights, all the fortifications you've seen here in Valletta, or for example in Mdina, all the watchtowers which you see here were built by the Knights. It was built to create protection. In fact, what you find is the Guardiola. Guardiola was the place where the Knights would obviously be there as a vigilance. And the signs on the Guardiola is an eye, which means from here I can see, an ear, from here I will hear, and like a bird, from here I will tell what I will see.
Built at the end of the 16th century, the Grand Master's Palace is decorated with paintings depicting the siege of Malta by the Ottoman forces and the Corsair Dragut. On May 18, 1565, 138 Turkish galleys arrived with 30,000 men ready to land on the Maltese shores. A 4-month siege then ensued, and with the arrival of reinforcements, the Ottomans decided to withdraw. This victory of the Knights of Malta, which marked the end of the Ottoman expansion in the Mediterranean, was celebrated throughout Christendom. The facade of Valletta's cathedral has an almost military austerity. The nave, on the other hand, with its lush display of gilt decorations, is a true masterpiece of Baroque art. The floor paving is simply extraordinary. The Grand Masters repose in elaborate tombs, whereas the knights of lesser rank are buried beneath the church's marble tomb slabs. The decidedly Baroque decorations of each tomb slab are a blend of religious themes and scenes of military life. We wind up our stopover on Malta, far from the gilt and pomp of the cathedral, with a visit to the small port of Marsaxlokk. An ancient tradition, perhaps dating back to the Arab period, the protective eyes painted on the prows of the fishing boats are intended to ward off bad luck at sea. Back on board the Pacifica, we go to one of the upper decks to enjoy a last look at Valletta's magnificent fortifications outlined against the deep blue waters of the Mediterranean. We leave Malta and head north towards Sicily. Early next morning, we come into sight of Palermo.
The Sicilian culture is a perfect reflection of its location in the Mediterranean. It's like a stopper between the northwest and southeast basins of the Mediterranean. No ship can pass if Sicily doesn't want it to. So the Sicilian culture is basically the culture of people passing through, who drop anchor, who settle for the most part on the coast, and who then learn how to communicate among themselves. And little by little that creates a people, a heterogeneous people, a community that doesn't really have an origin except in the recent past. There have been several successive waves of identity crises that allow us to now speak of a people, but the Sicilian identity does not date back to ancient times.
The history of Palermo is inscribed in the stone of its monuments. The 19th century, with its neoclassical facades. The Baroque 17th century, at the Quattro Canti, the crossroads with its 4 fountains ensconced in the facades. The 16th century, with the stunning Renaissance fountain in the Piazza Pretoria. This stroll back in time leads all the way to the 11th century. That's when the Lord Roger de Hauteville and his brothers set out from Normandy to conquer Muslim-occupied Sicily in the name of the church. The taking of Palermo in 1072 marked the beginning of the Norman reign in Sicily, a period when the arts and culture flourished.
In the Cathedral of Palermo, you have a former mosque transformed for use by Christians. It was the Friday Mosque, one of the largest in the city, which had 300 mosques according to the 13th century poet Jabbar. And so, as they made over this cathedral for the use of Christians, they added to the structure that already existed thanks to Islam. For example, the 4 angled towers that were added with the Aragonese. They're veritable minarets, if you look carefully. You can see a Renaissance portico. You have the original central nave, as well as the transept, a monochrome whose influence doesn't clash at all, but rather it blends in with the rest. There's only one fault of taste, and that was unavoidable. That's the dome added by Mr. Ferdinando Fuga, who was commissioned in the 18th century to reinforce the church against earthquakes. Now, of course, it has become part of the monument, and no one would dream of removing it.
This blend of Byzantine, Arab, and Norman influences can also be found in the tradition of the Sicilian marionettes, the famous pupi. Vincenzo, one of the few remaining practitioners of this tradition, makes his own marionettes. Vincenzo owns a small theater where he gives performances with his son, who makes the sets.
We carry on the ancient tradition of the old master marionettists. I inherited this tradition from my grandfather, and he had inherited it from his ancestors. It's important to maintain the tradition of these shows. We always play the same story, the story of Charlemagne, who really existed in the year 800. Charlemagne's mission was to protect Christ and the Pope and to make sure that Christianity would survive. And that's why we reenact this rivalry between the Normans and the Arabs.
Fermati Orlando! Cercavo proprio te, perché ho giurato di ucciderti e lo farò subito! Visitami tu! Fermati ora! E la farò pagare a noi, il cuore! A noi, Orlando! I noi!
I exercise this profession because I love it, because I grew up in a family that was already in this profession, and I hope that my children will carry on in my footsteps. But for that we need support. Before, there was the public, who would come every night and we would make a little money. Now that's finished. We count on the tourists.
The Pacifica slowly pulls away from Palermo. Our last night at sea will bring us to Civitavecchia. Our cruise will be over, but our voyage will continue. We still have Rome to discover. Rome, the eternal city, is there before us, spread out over the 7 legendary hills, with the Tiber flowing past their feet. During the course of our voyage, we've evoked the destinies of many different cultures and civilizations. The Greeks, Catalans, Carthaginians, Normans, Ottomans, each one of them at a certain moment in their history ruled a part of the Mediterranean. But only Rome succeeded in imposing its rule over the whole of this inland sea and making it their sea, Mare Nostrum. Walking through the capital of Italy, our feet are in fact treading the ancient Roman roads. As we admire the masterpieces of the Italian Renaissance, such as St. Peter's Basilica, topped with Michelangelo's grandiose dome, it's as if we were admiring ancient Rome. All the artists of the Quattrocento drew inspiration and nourished their talent from the impressive sight of the ruins of ancient Rome, the setting of their everyday life. The Capitol, with its monumental stairway designed by Michelangelo to welcome the triumphal entry of Charles V in 1536, is undoubtedly one of the most beautiful monuments of the Renaissance. In constructing the pedestal for the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius, which dates back to the 2nd century, Michelangelo reaffirmed the aesthetic bonds linking the Renaissance to ancient Rome. In spite of the countless Renaissance masterpieces, the ancient buildings always attract the most visitors, with the Colosseum leading the list.
These people bringing food You want to fight? Come on. Next time. Kill your friend. No, my friend, no.
I was a house painter. I still am, in fact. I paint apartments, but only in winter. When there's not enough work here, I go back to my painting job, but I spend just about the whole summer here. I leave the house with my costume in a bag and I change when I get here. I made the whole costume myself, but I had help from some people who had already made them. It's custom made for me, except the sandals and the helmet. They're a little more difficult to make. You can buy them, but if you really want to, you can make them yourself. I'm maybe one of the few here who doesn't do this as a job, but for fun. I like to mingle and talk with the people. I kid around with everyone. The only thing that might be a problem is, of course, money. But I'm in it more for the fun than the money.
When the barbarians invaded Rome, they destroyed the aqueducts and the fountains. With its water supply cut, the city went into a gradual decline in the Middle Ages. Then, thanks to the initiative of the popes, Rome progressively recovered the spirit of the great city it once was. And the symbol of this Renaissance was the fountains designed by the most gifted artists that once again adorned the city's piazzas.
In ancient times, Rome had a population of 1.5 million, but in the Middle Ages, that dropped to 30,000–40,000, no more than a small town. To re-establish the standing of Rome, the popes undertook the reconstruction of the city with the help of renowned artists. There was Bramante, already a great architect, the Sangallos, Raphael Sanzio, Michelangelo Buonarroti, and Gian Lorenzo Bernini a little later during the Baroque period. And in fact, it's all mixed together. When you go walking through Rome, you see that you can slip very easily and quickly from antiquity to modern times. And that, in fact, makes for the charm of Rome. You really have the testimony that shows how this city has evolved down through the centuries. The eternal city.
Hudson, and even throughout the rest of Europe.
Even though Marseille never regained the level of trade it had in ancient times, it remained an active port all through the Middle Ages. Then in the 15th century, it enjoyed another period of prosperity thanks to the accords between François I and the Ottoman Emperor Suleiman the Magnificent, and Marseille became an active hub of trade with the East. During the 17th century, France, like Holland and England, created their companies of the East and West Indies. However, thanks to the initiative of Colbert, Louis XIV's Minister of Finance, France also founded a Company of the Levant, which gave Marseille a new economic lease on life. The city and the port have undergone transformations. Louis XIV had a fortress built around the old St. John fort, dating from the 15th century. Later, the round tower of the Fanal was added on. And lastly, the Fort St. Nicholas was erected on the opposite bank of the narrow channel that marks the entrance to the inlet. Only a few of these traditional boats, called pointus, still tie up here to unload their morning's catch. Down through the centuries, the activity of the port followed the history of the city. The slow periods under Louis XIV and after the Revolution alternated with more prosperous times under the reign of François I, and even better times at the beginning of the 19th century when France embarked on its period of overseas colonization. The sailing ships and then the steamships of the big maritime companies set out from here to the four corners of the earth, towards Algeria from 1830 on, then starting in 1869 when the Suez Canal was opened, to Africa and far-off Asia. In a few decades, Marseille became a cosmopolitan metropolis. Orphans of a bygone era, the wharfs of La Joliette are now used by a good number of cruise ships and the ferries heading for Corsica and North Africa. Our cruise began in Genoa. Now, in the early morning after sailing all night, we've come into sight of Marseille. Marseille is the great historical port of France's Mediterranean coast. The oldest city of France and a true city of Provence, where the air is steeped in the fragrance of lavender and the fresh breeze of the sea, Marseille ripples with the sun-soaked accents of characters straight out of a novel by Marcel Pagnol, the most famous writer of the region. Times have changed. The old port, which used to be the heart of Marseille's activity, is now a marina for pleasure boats and excursions. Marseille's long romance with the world began a long time ago, 2,600 years ago, when one fine day, a handful of Greek colonists landed in the little uninhabited inlet.
Here we are on the site of what we call the ancient port, which is almost 200 meters from the old port. So this is the dead center of the city of Marseille, and with this archaeological site we see the origins of the city laid bare. We're at the end of the rocky inlet of Marseille that was discovered by the Greek sailors from Phocaea 2,600 years ago. So these were the quays of the ancient Greek, then Roman port of Marseille. In ancient times, Marseille was in fact a port that handled, let's say, strategic products, commercial products such as wine, olive oil, salted fish, metals as well, grain. So these were products and raw materials that were, of course, extremely important for life around the Mediterranean basin.
ages, the Mediterranean was considered the center of the world. From the Mideast to the Straits of Gibraltar, and from the south of France to the north of Africa, this inland sea has seen so many civilizations since antiquity that its shores are rich with some of the most beautiful cities in the world. In each one of these cities, there live men and women whose lives and traditions are the fruit of an amazing mix of cultures and religions. From Marseille's Old Port to the Barrio Gótico in Barcelona, from the Almudaina Palace in Palma to the Medina of Tunis, from the fortifications of Malta to the Cathedral of Palermo and the masterpieces of Rome, the Eternal City, all the cities that we'll be visiting during this voyage are, each in its own way, capitals of the Mediterranean.